My favourite monsters in all of Doctor Who are the Cybermen. Always have been, always will be. Their concept touches the back of my brain just enough for me to become obsessed with all the different angles it could take. I mean, what is more terrifying? An alien invader devoted to enslaving or destroying all life on Earth? Or the representation of the end of all life as we know it in favour of something that a computer deems as superior? It's the same end result. Humanity is buggered. Except the horror for the Cybermen isn't done through explosions and destruction. It's done through loss. Loss of identity, the loss of autonomy. It's the way that humanity itself is left by the wayside, kicked to the curb, and buried under the rubble, with a machine laughing over its makeshift grave. Metaphorically, of course. See, the Cybermen aren't just your average monster. They are the Black Mirror. They are the end result of tech being factored into the quest for relentless survival. Maybe even immortality. But sometimes, it feels like Doctor Who could go even further with them. They have embraced what the Cybermen stand for from day one, even if it has been a little inconsistent from time to time. But what if they take that horror aspect specifically further? This is just a theory anyway. So, we're going to look at 3 distinct ways that Doctor Who has treated the Cybermen. 3 distinct stories. And we're going to look at another example from science fiction that has an adjacent, yet similar thematic stance to the Cybermen. Created by Dr. Kip Pedler and Jerry Davis, the Cybermen made their debut in 1966's The 10th Planet, the final story of the original incarnation of the Doctor, as played by William Hartnell. And they were very different to the Cybermen that we have come to know in the modern times. These ones were bulky, shambling figures with cloth faces and huge, incredibly impractical chest units. But enough to make them seem very uncanny valley, because these guys were scary. From their intimidating appearance to their haunting sing-song voice, they felt on the cusp of humanity, but far enough away to be a haunting representation of what could become of them. And there is no real visible emotion, for the most part anyway. With technology rapidly advancing in the 60s and things like medicine and space tech, and with transplants and limb replacements becoming a very real thing, the Cybermen were almost an answer to this very sense of progression, something Kid Pedler would have direct experience with. In an interview with Jerry Davis, he had this to say about their time devising the Cybermen. Kid Pedler was a medical doctor, a pathologist, a scientist, and he had a feeling about medicine that if you started replacing too much of the human body, where do you stop? When does the result turn into a robot? He felt that you'd lose humanity if you kept replacing arms and legs, so I played on that. I said, well, suppose you had a race of beings who had started off with an artificial leg, and then another one, and then an arm, and this sort of thing, and finally there was perhaps a little core there. But the rest of them, the breathing, the brain functions, and everything was cybernetic. What would they be like? So we speculated and we decided they'd be very frightening people to run into on a dark night. Their design was created by Alexandra Tynan, also known as Sandra Reed, during her time on the show. In a 1991 interview for fanzine DWB, she said, "I did have guidelines on the first show because I was introduced to Kid Pedler, who had created the Cybermen. We chatted about it and he told me about cybernetics and tried to explain what it was all about. Cybernetics at that stage was something so new. A pacemaker was the only thing that you could put in someone's body that wasn't human flesh and muscle. And I guess, if I had to do it now, I would have approached it from a slightly different direction. In one sense, the cyber costume was very simple, but what interests me now is that it was apparently very frightening to a lot of children. But I always operated on the basis that less is more. That simplified things can often be much more scary than something which is very involved and very high-tech in its design." Part of what makes the 10th Planet Cybermen so effective is that even at this point, while they are still basically stitched together surgical patients, they have divorced themselves so far from emotions that they don't even understand the meanings of them anymore. Instead, They believe themselves to be genuinely superior because they are free from such things. With the addition of being biologically superior, immune to disease, unaffected by the temperature, and with a slavish devotion to their own survival by any means necessary. It is really sublime characterization. Their apathy towards anything that is not related to themselves is what drives them here, willing to destroy Earth to ensure the survival of their home planet of Mondas. They couldn't give a crap about what happens to humans, not because they won't, but because they can't. Their programming won't allow it. And sometimes, apathy in itself can be more effective than anger or hatred. Because how do you reason with apathy? And once again, therein lies the horror. Because these creatures were once people too. Listen to Big Finish's Spare Parts, one of the best Cybermen stories out there. It provides a thorough examination into the culture of the Mondasian society under the crushing rule of the Committee, and gives us background to these Cybermen. The aspect that I want to focus on, if only not to give too much of the story away, is on the character of Yvonne Hartley. Her fate is utterly heartbreaking and encapsulates the tragedy that is being turned into a Cyberman. Yvonne lived with her father and her brother on Mondas, and was an optimistic and friendly young woman who wanted a better life for all on Mondas. She lived with chronic lung condition, doomed to be dead in months, and Sister Man Constant reports her as a conscript for the surface work crew. And she is so desperate for her father to see her uniform. And then, she is processed. Or rather, semi-processed. The power goes out during her upgrade, resulting in her only being half converted, resulting in confused, shambolic Cybermen, Yvonne included. And she was still so desperate for her father to see her uniform. Only knowing what her human self wanted, she goes home. She's unrecognizable to her family. They are terrified of her. Even her own father is, until she calls him Dad. They try to remove the mask. They don't know it's her face now. And yet she is distressed. It is so beautifully acted and written, but also haunting and truly harrowing. Watching this family process their ailing but once shining daughter struggle through life even more as this hulking mass of metal, plastic and cloth. They were back together, like a proper family. Until the power comes back and her conversion becomes too much for her, and she dies in agony. Yvonne's mini-arc is a tragic and almost cautionary tale in its own right, and easily one of the best Cyberman stories there has ever been, so I do recommend that you give it a go. Now, I'd like to veer in a bit of a different direction. This might be seen as a bit of a digression, but trust me, it does have a point. I want to have a little chat about a certain other species in another sci-fi universe who also embody an existential horror of sorts. They assimilate beings into their consciousness and force you to become like them. They take your body and fill it with all sorts of metal and cybernetics to which you wouldn't even recognize yourself. That's right, I'm talking about the obvious comparison point to the Cybermen, the Borg from Star Trek. The Borg are effectively Star Trek's answer to the Cybermen for the reasons outlined above. Both represent a dark technological fate for any species, and embody the loss of individuality, replaced with a singular goal to upgrade and expand their forces to ensure their own survival. Don't get me wrong, the two are vastly different in terms of their appearances and their context, but their raw concepts, races who were once humanoid taking on technology to survive and assimilate others, remain. The Borg first appeared in Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2 episode Q-Who, in which the godlike entity Q, in effort to prove to the Enterprise crew that they need him, throws the ship into an unexplored yet devastated sector of the galaxy, and right into the path of a Borg cube, which instantly takes an interest in them. Guinan refers to the Borg as a devastator of her people, while Q calls them enhanced humanoids. They are portrayed as a mysterious threat with no obvious goal, other than destruction. 18 people on the Enterprise die in the first encounter, and yet they seem invincible. They adapt to weaponry and self-repair with ease, but as we learn more about them, we discover things aren't quite so simple. For example, when Riker, Data and Worf board the ship, they find babies being converted into Borg. They are effectively upgrading babies, which in itself is something they share in common with the Cybermen. In The Doctor Falls, the Doctor states how conversion is easier with the young. Brains are fresher, bodies are smaller. Less to throw away. It isn't until their next encounter in Season 3's finale, The Best of Both Worlds, that we learn the Borg do not simply kill. They assimilate. Much like the Cybermen, they take life and upgrade it into a cyborg. But with the Borg, it goes deeper. Their mission statement is simple. They wish to reach perfection by continually improving themselves, thus assimilating different species into their collective, removing their individuality, and turning them into one of their own for the benefit of the collective's experience. As they say, the targeted culture will adapt to service theirs. Resistance is futile. And one of the best ways that this horror has been documented is through the effect that it had on the lead character, Jean-Luc Picard. Picard was assimilated by the collective, and there is sheer terror in what they made him do. He was reprogrammed into Locutus of Borg, a mouthpiece for the Borg collective, but in doing so, they took from him all his knowledge of Starfleet's military strategies. The result? Picard was the leader and a victim of one of the worst bloodbaths in Star Trek history, the Battle of Wolf 359. He is forced to watch his colleagues die before his eyes in an incident that he goes on to feel responsible for. He is devastated. He is traumatized by this. It comes out when he fights with his brother, crying and feeling so distraught that he couldn't stop them.
You don't know, Robert. You don't know. They took everything I was. He used me to kill and to destroy, and I couldn't stop them. I should have been able to stop them. I tried. I tried so hard. But I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't good enough. I should have been able to stop them. I should.
Becomes emotionally compromised and dangerously obsessed in his hatred of the Borg, refusing to lose the Enterprise E to them.
Not again. The line must be drawn here. This far, no farther.
When he meets people who had suffered themselves due to his time and actions as Locutus, such as Benjamin Sisko or Liam Shaw, we see that pain resurfacing within him. The psychological effect of that trauma has never left him, and it will never leave him. It's a horror that only he can understand, that only he can face. The experience of having lost his identity, his autonomy, himself. It'll haunt him forever, no matter how much he may try to move on. One difference between them and the Cybermen is the Borg operate as a collective with individual elements, whereas the Cybermen operate as individuals working to be a collective, but both of them are relentless in their drive to eliminate free will. Much like the Borg, the Cybermen thrive on cold, simple logic to strip away their weaknesses like emotions and all that. They have the same end goal. One contrasting factor is their hierarchy. Cybermen are more diverse than the Borg in that sense. Cybermen have multiple leaders, controllers, a planner across the various incarnations. The Borg? Only one queen. Their own horror of forcing someone to become a single-goal organism with no will of their own, but the simple, contradictory goal of ambition. Whilst the Cybermen themselves were created out of a need for self-preservation. Losing your soul for perfection? Or losing your soul for survival? Take your pick. And that's why these two species, whilst having their differences, are two sides of the same coin. Throughout the years, the horror aspect of the Cybermen on screen became more downplayed. not only down to refining their looks in the 60s, despite those stories still maintaining the high quality, especially Tomb of the Cybermen, but also particularly through the 70s and 80s, as the focus on them became the Doctor's foes are up to no good again, much akin to the Daleks. And I do feel that loses what makes the Cybermen such a unique and interesting set of villains. Stories like Earthshock were still excellent, stories that the Cybermen deserve, but stories like Revenge of the Cybermen and Silver Nemesis don't really do their original horror concept justice in any way, shape or form. The further you push the Cybermen towards the realm of being generic bad guys that just need to be stopped, their effectiveness crashes faster than Wall Street in 1929. So now we've come to the modern era, a whole new kind of Cyberman for a whole new age of Doctor Who. With the revival of the show and the very successful revival of the Daleks, Rusty Davies and his team set to work creating the new incarnation of the Cybermen for Series 2 to face the 10th Doctor, Rose Tyler and Mickey Smith. We were greeted with Rise of the Cybermen, written by Tom McRae. These were a conceptually new kind of Cybermen, belonging to a parallel Earth, and ditching the known history of the race up to this point. Mondas no more. Born out of technological ambition and corporate exploitation, it almost takes a cyberpunk light edge, having a dystopian massive corporation being behind the upgrades. Instead of it being more species survival focused like before, it's more individual survival focused. Cybers Industries creates the Cybermen as a way to upgrade humanity, and this was all born out of the ambition of just one man. Not a species, just one very ill but very ambitious man. John Lumick, an inventor, an innovator on the parallel Earth. He, through Cybers Industries, was responsible for many of the technological upgrades that the world had benefited from. However, Lumick's body was severely unwell, to the point of him requiring a wheelchair with an inbuilt life support system, all while he researched ways to defy mortality and increase his own lifespan before eventually coming to the ultimate upgrade project, his Cybermen. These were envisioned as new exoskeletons that would house only the brain from the body to free it from the constraints of ailing flesh, a way for him to get a form of immortality. Lumick was desperate. He was determined to get this project over the line, but at every opportunity he was knocked back by the government, the president himself calling it absurd and condemning Lumick to death in his own eyes. Despite this, he developed the project in secrecy, going as far to kidnap homeless people to use as test subjects, taking people who he was sure no one would miss for the sheer ease of it, and killing anyone who stood in his way. From his point of view, he was righteous. He had the right of a man to survive, which was how he justified the crimes he was committing to ensure his creations came to light, going to the extent of even assassinating the president to do so. And thus, the Cybermen were born, equipped with emotional inhibitors that prevented them from feeling, well, any feeling of any sort. But as well as that, these Cybermen had clear memories of their former life, such as Jackie Tyler's. Lumick himself is upgraded ahead of schedule. Even he was somewhat reluctant to become his own creation until he had absolutely no other option. One man's desperation to survive triggered all this, while he felt trapped in his own body, and in doing so began a global network of cyber upgrades that would cause millions of others to feel trapped in theirs, covered up in a mass of cyber programming and forced obedience. There is a hell of a lot of terror in how they are defeated as well. The Doctor has to give them back the one thing they wouldn't be able to cope with in their current state: their emotions, and the realizations of what they had become, their former personalities returning to the service after being buried beneath cold technology. He literally kills them. They all meet a tragic end, really, and the Doctor can only say that he is sorry. I like to think that the horror in the Rise of the Cybermen Age of Steel two-parter is quite overt, but I guess some of it can go under the radar maybe. But if it hits, and you get it, you really do feel it. The Cybermen for this reason are one of my favourite kinds of Cybermen ever for what they represent at their core. Desperation for survival, taken into the realm of indulgence and ethical ignorance. And Lumic is a very fascinating character too, being the sole instigator for the Cybermen. He is their Davros, no bones about it. And now to my personal favourite of the stories we cover today. The finale of Series 10 is biblical by any means and truly explores a ton of the existential horror that the Cybermen bring with them to the table. They are gorgeous episodes, marvellously written, beautifully directed, brilliantly acted, and genuinely a perfect note for the 12th Doctor era to end on. Yes, Twice Upon a Time is a coda, and a thoroughly okay one at that, but this is where the money is. But enough of me gushing, I digress. We're here to talk depression. Through the bulk of the latter RTD and earlier Moffat eras, the horror of the Cybermen was only lightly touched upon. It probably reached its lightest with Nightmare in Silver, where the Cybermen were at their most robotic and cartoonish, with a greater emphasis on their new special abilities, and even the next Doctor had a darker psychological element to it, but Nightmare played up the robot side of the Cybermen way too much. This was then followed by the whiplash effect of Dark Water, Death in Heaven, which was filled with its own kind of horror, but even then, the Cybermen were not quite conventional. The horror came from the utilization and implications of death, rather than the Cybermen themselves. But Danny Pink as a corpse Cyberman was a very coolly executed concept in its own right. Maybe that's worth discussing on its own merits at another point in time. But now, we come to World Enough in Time and The Doctor Falls, written by Stephen Moffat. These two episodes take the Cyberman experience and really dials up the horror element to the absolute best it has ever been dialed up in the modern era. The themes of identity, autonomy, survival, a distinct influence from spare parts, but it does something different to what has been seen on screen before. It goes visceral with it on a psychological level, through the experience of the 12th Doctor's companion, friend and student, Bill Potts. The 10-year journey that she endures throughout the two-parter, from being an unwitting accomplice to Missy's attempt at being good, to being a disabled friend and roommate to the Master in disguise, to becoming a new victim of cyber conversion, and then to overcoming her programming and fighting to keep hold of her identity against all odds within the cyber shell that she has been forced into. It is, quite frankly, one of the most well-told companion departed stories ever in my humble opinion, but also one of the most horrific, and that's probably objective at this point. The colony ship and its time dilation already presents an interesting setup, and the supposed death of Bill in a subversion of what should have been a routine Doctor Saves the Day moment, the fact that she is condemned to spend all those years in miserable surroundings with only one friend and a faint amount of hope that the Doctor will find her, keeping her going. Bill's dragged out two-stage transformation into a Cyberman feels very spare parts. She is taken all the way down to the hospital where time moves extremely slowly compared to the top, and is equipped with a cumbersome chest unit that refuses to function outside of the hospital to save her life. For the most part, she is now trapped. And not only that, she encounters a real travesty of medical care within it. And that is the patients. People who had already undergone partial conversions and were in unbelievable agony as a result. They were literally begging for death and asking to be killed, demonstrating how much pain they were in by just saying the same things over and over again. It was not only harrowing for Bill to watch, but for us to view. These people were being used as test subjects, proto-Cybermen. The process which was supposed to bring everlasting life, to fix everything that was wrong with them, now has them reduced to faceless drones suffering everlasting pain. Bill's revival has come at a cost, but so far, she has at least been able to keep her personality. Her strange found friendship with Razor is her only lifeboat within the sea of despair down there, as the two become quite close, to Bill's perception anyway. Unfortunately, the Master is simply playing with her, leading her towards a darker fate of actually being turned into a full-fledged Cyberman. Her one ally in an unfamiliar world betrayed her for what seemed like no reason at all, and it devastated her. And the fact that the Doctor and Nardole arrived to get her only minutes too late after her conversion is a completely sick joke. But it became a testament to how strong of a person Bill Potts was. Even after her conversion, she retains her personality. She saves the Doctor's life. She keeps her mind through sheer force of will, strengthened through the months she lived under the rule of the monks. She tries with all her will to see herself as her human form, to believe she is human, to maintain that humanity, even though, as she says herself, she feels like she is hanging on in a hurricane. When she speaks, she hears herself. When she looks at herself, she sees Bill. But when she looks in a mirror, then she sees what she has become. When we see her through the eyes of everyone else who isn't the Doctor, we see what she is. And the more she sees the Cybermen, the more she is losing control on who she is. Whilst it was definitely inspired by the fact that Peter Capaldi loves the 10th Planet Cybermen, the revisitation of this early style of Cybermen is an especially inspired choice. And this is absolutely a ton more effective than if the Cybers or Nightmare models were used instead for this particular scene. The sing-song voice, the cloth face, even with a modernized version that is more refined compared to the original 10th Planet ones, a little less bulky, it still has that horrifying, uncanny effect that there is a person under there who has effectively lost their humanity and a desperate need for survival. And this is the implied fate of everyone in that lower city, as it progresses through generations, years, as the Cybermen proceed to refine their tech and upgrade themselves into better and better forms. But Bill holds on, through everything, for weeks, even when she is kept in a barn. The scene where the Doctor confesses to her what she actually is powerful. She will now always be treated different because of what she is, despite it not being her fault. She has to retain her calmness. She can't be angry, because she is now a Cyberman. Even the Doctor acts awkwardly around her at the start, because he knows that this is a very volatile situation. Even with the Doctor by her side, Bill is still isolated through this experience that she is enduring. She has been taken from her life, forced into a danger that she was assured that she would never go through. She was isolated from the Doctor and Nardole for 10 years, and when she finally gets back to them, she is still isolated from them in a different way. She lives in constant danger of her mind being lost to the cyber programming, and no one wants to be around her, and the Master even mocks her. And this all culminates in when Bill tells the Doctor that she doesn't want to live if she can't be her. And that, in its rawest form, exemplifies the existential horror of the Cybermen. They take everything from you and spit you out as an emotionless drone to impart the same fate unto others. Despite everything she went through, Bill's story is lucky to have a happy ending, ultimately. But the vast number of others who become Cybermen were never able to have that. In this universe, every Cyberman we see was once a person with thoughts and feelings. Everyone went through a similar experience to what Bill did, either slowly or rapidly. And they are all trapped in a seemingly endless, unnaturally prolonged existence, all in the name of survival. And the only thing left to ask is, was it worth it? And this brings us to a very unique and curious case when it comes to the Cybermen that I'd like to lightly touch upon. Normally people are taken against their will, but all their beginnings had to start because of a desperation to survive. However, there is one Cyberman who was very different. Someone who offered himself up to the cause willingly. Ashad. Ashad was introduced in The Haunting of Villa Diodati, written by Maxine Alderton, and he is a terrifying example of what the Cybermen can be if someone joined their cause willingly. Ashad became a dedicated follower of the Cybermen during the Cyber Wars, despite being a family man and having multiple children of his own. We don't know a great deal canonically about his background, but we can surmise it. If I may take a bit of creative liberty, he was absolutely indoctrinated. He was a mere civilian when he was first confronted with the Cyber Empire on his world, and was tempted by the notion of a life without death, without sickness, and without emotion. I mean, there are multiple examples over centuries of how easy it is for people to be indoctrinated and radicalized to a cause in the real world. I mean, that's the entire basis of things like cults, and how they lure in people with promises, especially those who are vulnerable. If people are going to be promised something that could change their lives for the better, then certain folks may well join that cause, and that's what happened with Ashad. He almost believed it to be a holy purpose, deeming it to be his ascension. His children were naturally against this. They were against the Cyber Empire, not bought in by any of their words, and as they invaded, they stood firmly against them, and thus they stood against their father. But Ashad was so radicalized by the Cybermen that once he learned about that, he slit his children's throats. He tried to join the Cyber Empire. He gave up his family for them. He offered himself up as a willing recruit, only for them to reject him, and he lived his life in shame. But then, he deluded himself into believing he was the apparent savior of the cyber race, taking it upon himself to revive them after their losses in the cyber wars. I wish we knew more about his history, as he is a genuinely fascinating concept for a character who is very much underused in all but one of his stories. Haunting of Villa Diodati and Essential of the Cybermen painted a picture of a man who was embittered and obsessed with the Cybermen to the point of it destroying him both mentally and eventually physically. I mean, just look at the state of him. He is an imperfect Cyberman, having to continually change himself with broken cyber parts after an incomplete upgrade, becoming a shadow of his former self. And it's an odd situation where someone desperately stakes their own identity on the possibility of being included into the cyber race, and how some of the things that the Cybermen promise aren't always treated with fear, but with desire from some. He rejected having an emotional inhibitor because he didn't believe he needed to be stabilized, despite the fact that he is incredibly emotional, driven by anger and self-hatred. He hates being humanoid and wants to be a pure Cyberman. It speaks to how crazed the cause drove him to be, and he himself is a byproduct of the horror of the Cybermen, just in a completely different angle to what you'd expect from their concept. The true existential horror of the Cybermen isn't their power, their logic, or their efficiency. It's that they remind us of our own potential for self-destruction through attempting to survive. And in doing so, we may well lose everything that makes us human.